It was an evening like any other, or so the family thought. After weeks of juggling work, school, and life's everyday chaos, they finally had a chance to enjoy a special night out. The mother, Sarah, had been looking forward to this for days. She wore a soft smile as she held the hands of her two young kids, Emma and Jack, while her husband, Mark, stood by her side. The kids were already chatting excitedly about the meal they would have, their eyes wide with anticipation. "We're going to have so much fun tonight," Emma squealed, clutching a toy in one hand and her dad's hand in the other. Mark chuckled. "We sure are, kiddo." It wasn't just any restaurant they were going to. The place had a reputation for serving incredible food, with rave reviews all over town. For weeks Sarah and Mark had been planning this night. It wasn't just about the meal, it was about being together as a family, away from their busy lives, a time to reconnect, laugh, and enjoy each other's company. The restaurant was nestled on a quiet corner, the warm glow of its lights inviting them in. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day's stress melt away. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. They had reservations after all, everything was set. But little did they know, this dinner would take an unexpected turn, one that would leave them feeling far from the joy they had hoped for. As the family walked up to the restaurant, their excitement grew. They could already smell the delicious aromas wafting out of the door. The warm, cozy atmosphere inside was exactly what they needed. Mark opened the door, and they stepped inside, greeted by the sound of soft chatter and clinking silverware. It felt like the perfect spot for their long-awaited family night. The hostess, a young woman with a bright smile, looked up as they approached. "Good evening, do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone polite but rushed. Sarah smiled and nodded. "Yes, we have a reservation under Johnson." The hostess quickly scanned her computer screen, but after a moment her smile faded. She glanced at them, then back at the screen. "I'm sorry, but it seems we don't have anything available right now," Mark frowned. "We made this reservation a week ago, it should be here." He pulled out his phone and showed her the confirmation email. The hostess glanced at the phone and then back at the family. "I'm really sorry, but I don't see anything for tonight." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "We're completely booked at the moment. You could try coming back later?" Sarah's stomach dropped. They had been so excited, and now they were being turned away for no clear reason. Mark, always the peacemaker, tried to stay calm. "Is there any chance you can find a table? We have two young kids with us. We've been really looking forward to this." The hostess shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Sorry for the inconvenience." She didn't seem to be in a hurry to offer any other solution. A heavy silence fell over the family. Emma and Jack, still clutching their parents' hands, looked around in confusion. They had been expecting the night to go smoothly, but now everything felt uncertain. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady for the kids. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll figure something out." But deep down, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. Why were they being turned away like this? The restaurant wasn't even full. There were empty tables scattered around. Something didn't feel right. Mark squeezed her hand. "Let's take a moment outside and figure this out." The cool night air hit them as they stepped outside the restaurant. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could see the disappointment on Emma's face, her little eyes already starting to fill with confusion. Jack was holding his sister's hand tightly, but his small voice broke the silence. "Why can't we eat here, Mom?" he asked, looking up at her with innocent eyes. Sarah knelt down beside him. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know, sweetie. We're just going to figure it out." Mark stood off to the side, his arms crossed. He stared at the restaurant's door, still unsure about what had just happened. They'd made a reservation, they had a plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Something's off," he said, his voice low. "That hostess wasn't even trying to help us. There are empty tables in there. Why are we being turned away?" Sarah nodded, her mind racing. Maybe it's a mistake, maybe they're just having some sort of mix-up. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her gut. She looked at Mark, her face filled with concern. "I don't know, Mark, it just doesn't feel right." Emma tugged on her mom's sleeve, her voice trembling. "Are we going to have to go home now?" Sarah crouched down to her daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart. We're not going home. We'll find somewhere else. Don't worry, okay?" But deep down, Sarah knew it wasn't just about finding somewhere else to eat, it was the principle of it. They had been treated like they didn't matter, like their reservation didn't mean anything. It was embarrassing. It was hurtful. She could see the same thoughts running through Mark's mind, though he was trying his best not to show it. The family stood there for a moment, uncertain. Sarah felt a sense of helplessness creeping in. They had been so excited, so hopeful for this evening, and now it seemed like that dream was slipping through their fingers. Then Mark glanced at the street, his eyes catching something in the distance. Something, or rather, someone that seemed out of place. Just as the family stood there, uncertain of what to do next, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The sound of the engine slowly fading, it came to a stop with a quiet purr. The car was polished to a shine, the kind of vehicle that turned heads without trying. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and well-dressed in a sharp suit. He was the kind of person who seemed to glide instead of walk, his every movement deliberate and confident. He wore dark sunglasses, even though it was evening, and had an air of quiet authority about him. His presence instantly drew attention. The family barely noticed at first, too wrapped up in their own frustrations, but the man's entrance did not go unnoticed by the restaurant staff. A few of the employees inside glanced up at him with quick recognition, and suddenly, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The hostess, who had just turned the family away moments before, straightened up when she saw him. The other staff members stood a little taller, a little more alert. The man, still not looking at the family, walked through the front door, bypassing the line of waiting guests without a second glance. No one stopped him, no one questioned him. It was as if he was a regular at the place, though the family had never seen him before. Then, without warning, he turned toward the family standing by the entrance. His gaze shifted to Sarah, Mark, and their kids. He paused for a brief moment, taking in the sight of them standing outside, their faces a mix of confusion and disappointment. There was a quiet curiosity in his eyes, but also something else, something deeper. He seemed to understand in an instant that something wasn't right. He took a few steps toward them. Sarah noticed him first, and for a split second, her heart raced. He wasn't just anyone, he had an air about him that was unmistakable. But what made her stop was how he didn't just pass by, like everyone else. He stopped and asked, his voice calm but direct. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his gaze shifting from Sarah to Mark, then to the kids. Mark looked at the man, his face still showing confusion, but he quickly replied. "We were just turned away, we have a reservation, but they're saying there's no table for us." The man's brow furrowed slightly, then softened. He glanced back at the restaurant, clearly taking in the scene. After a beat, he spoke again, his voice steady. "Something doesn't seem right," he said, before turning and walking straight into the restaurant. The family stood in stunned silence, as the well-dressed man disappeared into the restaurant. They exchanged glances, unsure of what had just happened. Mark was the first to break the silence. "Who was that?" he whispered, though the question hung in the air unanswered. Sarah didn't have an answer. Emma and Jack, still holding on to their parents, were too young to fully understand, but they could feel the shift in the air. Something about the situation was different now. Minutes passed, the night air felt colder, the disappointment heavier. Sarah kept her eyes on the door, wondering what was going on inside. She couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, things were about to change, but how? Then, just as Sarah was about to suggest they leave and find another place, the door opened again. The man reappeared, this time with a calm but authoritative presence. He was smiling faintly, but there was no mistaking the seriousness behind his eyes. "Are you all still here?" he asked, his voice warm, but there was a quiet power in it. He looked directly at Sarah, then at Mark. "I've taken care of things inside, they'll seat you now, please follow me." Mark stood still for a moment, his brows furrowed in disbelief. He looked at Sarah, unsure if he had heard correctly. Wait, what? You did what? The man smiled, almost as if he were amused by the surprise in their faces. I spoke with the manager. They're going to get you seated right away. His voice was reassuring, confident. Sarah blinked, trying to wrap her mind around the situation. She glanced at Mark, who was still processing. You spoke with the manager, Sarah repeated. Why would you do that? The man's smile remained, though now it softened. I couldn't stand to see a family turned away, especially when there's no reason for it. I know what it's like to want something simple, like a nice meal, and have it ruined for no good reason. It's a shame, really. The family exchanged glances once again. The entire situation was strange, yet there was something undeniably comforting about his words. He wasn't just offering to help, they could feel the sincerity behind them. Please, the man continued, with a small encouraging nod. Don't let this ruin your night, let's go in. Dinner's waiting. The family followed the man back inside the restaurant, still unsure of what to think. The staff, who had been so cold before, now greeted them with a level of respect that felt almost unnatural. The hostess, who had just turned them away, now stood with a forced smile, as though she were doing her best to appear polite. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable as they walked past her. The man led them to a table near the back of the restaurant, away from the bustle of the front. It was a quiet corner, intimate but still close enough to see the entire room. The waiter quickly pulled out chairs for them, showing a level of courtesy that hadn't been offered before. He placed menus on the table with a nod, and stepped back. Sarah and Mark sat down, the kids taking their places beside them, though they were still too confused to understand the change in atmosphere. They were now seated at a beautiful table, the kind that had seemed off-limits just moments ago. The whole situation felt unreal. The man sat down across from them, his eyes scanning the room briefly before focusing back on the family. He didn't seem rushed or impatient. His presence was calm, almost as if he had done this 1,000 times before. So, how are you all doing now? He asked, his tone kind, but with a sense of quiet authority. Is everything better now? Sarah nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. She glanced at Mark, who seemed just as confused, but also a little relieved. Yes, she said slowly. Thank you for all of this. I don't even know what to say. The man smiled faintly. You don't need to say anything. I just hate seeing things like this happen. A family like yours should be able to enjoy a meal without trouble. Mark glanced up at the man, his voice low but with curiosity. I don't understand. Why did you help us? Why did you go through all that trouble? The man's expression softened, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, as if thinking carefully about how to answer. I guess I'm just the kind of person who believes in fairness. And when something feels off, I try to make it right. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Sarah and Mark exchanged looks again, their minds racing to figure out who this man was, and why he cared so much about their little problem. As the family sat at the table, they began to relax a little, though the surprise of it all hadn't worn off. The kids were still a little confused, but started to warm up to the idea of a nice dinner. Emma picked up her fork, glancing at the menu. Jack was still looking around, his eyes wide with curiosity. Everything about the restaurant felt more welcoming now, but the feeling of being saved by this stranger lingered in the air. So, what's your name? Sarah finally asked, her voice soft but filled with genuine gratitude. She was still processing everything. Who was this man who had stepped in to change their evening? The man looked up at her, his smile returning. Oh right, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Charles. Charles Peterson. The name didn't ring any bells for Sarah or Mark. They had no idea who he was, but there was something about him that made them feel like he was important, like he had more influence than he let on. Charles, Sarah repeated, nodding slowly. Well, thank you again for what you did. I don't know how we would have gotten through tonight without you. It was nothing, Charles said with a humble shrug, though it didn't seem like nothing. I just want people to be treated right. That's all. Mark looked at him with a raised eyebrow. You know, I'm still trying to figure out why you did all this. You don't even know us. Charles smiled, his eyes glinting with a quiet understanding. Sometimes it's not about knowing people, it's about doing the right thing when you see someone in need. There was a long pause. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance. The kids were still distracted, but Sarah and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. Well, Charles. Sarah finally said, we're lucky you were here tonight. Charles only nodded, his smile never fading. It was clear he didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but Sarah and Mark both knew this was no ordinary man. Something about him felt different, like he was someone who had the power to change their lives in ways they couldn't yet understand. As the meal continued, the atmosphere began to feel more comfortable. The kids were finally enjoying their food, their earlier confusion forgotten, as they dug into their meals. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced with the warmth of a shared family moment, but there was still that nagging question lingering in the back of Sarah's mind: who was this man? Charles watched the family eat for a while, his eyes soft and thoughtful. He didn't seem to be in a rush. It was as though he was savoring the moment, the quiet comfort of knowing he had made a difference. Finally, after a few minutes, he leaned forward, his gaze meeting Sarah and Mark's. You know, Charles said casually, I haven't been completely honest with you. Sarah and Mark exchanged curious glances. What do you mean? Mark asked, his voice gentle but cautious. Charles smiled, though it was a little more knowing now. I guess I should have introduced myself properly. I'm Charles Peterson, CEO of Peterson Industries. The name didn't immediately ring a bell for Sarah or Mark, but they could tell by the way he said it that it was important. Peterson Industries. Sarah repeated, her brow furrowed. I'm not sure I've heard of it. Charles nodded, his expression turning a little more serious. We're a tech company. We deal with everything from renewable energy to advanced robotics. We've been around for a while now, but we try to keep a low profile. Sarah and Mark exchanged wide-eyed looks. This man, this stranger who had saved their night, was a billionaire. Someone who had the power to change the world, and yet he was sitting with them, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Why would someone like you help us? Mark asked, still struggling to understand. Charles's eyes softened. Because it's the right thing to do. You're just a family trying to enjoy a meal. That matters.